Good morning, everyone. Guten Morgen. Herzlich willkommen. Welcome to the symposium Navigating Multiplicity, Artistic Exchanges in East, Southeast, and South Asia, 1950s to 1980s. We're very, very delighted to host this symposium and later on Sunday, Emerging Scholars Workshop together with the Goethe Institute. Robin, representing the Goethe Institute, will say a few words in a sec. The symposium concludes a 2-year research trajectory. This is a research co-initiated by Su Wei, Beijing-based curator Su Wei. Do you want to wave to everyone? Su Wei and myself, with itinerant workshops in Bandung, Beijing, Hanoi, Manila, and online workshops in Seoul and Mumbai. So one initial aim of this research project is to map artistic and cultural productions on different sides of the Cold War divide. And we very much realized that we each had our own blind spots along the process as we moved through different front lines and end lines of the Cold War in Asia. And we started pinpointing the agency of different individual artists, institutional practitioners, and policymakers. And I think in the symposium coming up, you will see many of these inquiries. I also want to iterate why it's important to have the concluding symposium in Kassel at Documenta Institute, and actually in this very building, which houses each Documenta since the 1950s, because Documenta is, of course, a product of the Cold War itself, right? It comes out of a certain German search for its own identity, trying to become open, trying to engage with questions and constructions of democracy and freedom. So it worked very well as part of the Cold War, the cultural Cold War milieu. And we'll certainly see and hear some of these narratives from other elsewhere in the world. But if the Western hemispheric cultural Cold War seems more stable, and because also there has been a lot more research done on this, I would say that, and I think this is shared by many of the researchers, that in Asia, we tend to see a lot more shifting alignments in the political, ideological, and economic arena. So all of this kind of complicates the story of the cultural Cold War. We'll see actors pursuing moving targets in a constantly moving unfolding of the history of the Cold War. So having this as mirrors to Documenta and to the Western cultural Cold War history, I think also serves to advance the self-understanding of the very institution where we are. And also, lastly, I want to highlight that we find ourselves in a moment of geopolitical turmoil in the last few years. And all of this adds a sense of urgency to our research because now we're not looking at the Cold War, we're looking at the post-Cold War political, ideological, and economic realignments happening right in front of our eyes, right? And I think as these master frames are being challenged, if not shattered, we need to have a better understanding of how we got here in order to understand what we can do now. And I think this is also in the interest of the Goethe Institute in general, because we've worked with overall 8 to 10 Goethe Institute offices in different parts of Asia, and a lot of the practitioners, some of you are here, what you're busy on a day-to-day with is trying to come up with a cultural policy that works for today. So I'd like to extend my thanks to the Goethe Institute. I'll name the offices that we worked with: Goethe Institute China, Hanoi, Jakarta, Bandung, Kyoto, Manila, Mumbai, Kolkata, and Seoul. We have different partners in different cities. These are too many to name here. I also like to thank Su Wei for co-initiating the project. I like to thank the Documenta Institute team. Many of them are kind of behind the scene. Haiyan, Sophia, Michael, please wave. And also all the panelists and those participating in the Emerging Scholars Workshop on Sunday, and of course to all the audience for venturing out to here because I think it's raining right now. So thank you so much. I give the floor to Robin now.
Well, thank you, Yomi. On behalf of the Goethe Institute, I would like to very warmly welcome you to this very juicy exercise. First of all, thanks a lot to Yomi and to Sue for your inspiration, for your nomadic management of this 2.5-year exercise, which included workshops in cities, which Yomi already mentioned. I'm very happy that two of my colleagues are here, Ingo Schöning, who's the Regional Program Director for South Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, and also the host of the very first workshop, which naturally had to happen in Bandung. Thank you for that. And also Enzio Wetzel, director of Goethe Institute Kyoto, which hosts the beautiful artist residency Villa Kamogawa. And yes, as Yomi mentioned, for the Goethe Institute, there are many important questions involved. And now that we are celebrating, or let's say commemorating 70 years of the Bandung Conference in 1955, where everyone was looking at some alternative and inspiring narratives for a world order even beyond maybe the West and the East. We also in our daily lives ask ourselves what went wrong with those narratives. There have been lots of wars of enemy ships within Asia. There have been wars even like between India and China. So we thought this could be an exciting opportunity to find out what kind of narratives did we lose, which ones did we not pay attention to, and considering the very complex world disorder that Yomi also decently referred to, I think we need some new ideas. We are all exhausted. And I would like to thank all the researchers, many of whom are here, contributing by case studies and to the workshops. And so we hope that by the end of the conference, that we'll be strongly inspired and know what to do in the future. Thank you so much, and looking forward to some inspiring dialogues.
Okay, we're entering into the official part of the symposium part of the symposium after a very I think enriching group activity, ice breaking. So and please don't forget the timeline; they're still there, and we can still add notes and add dots and also add historical events to that. So the afternoon panel will start with the first one, moderated by myself. I'll introduce very briefly the three panelists. They all have long and stellar bios, so I only say the quintessential. So the first speaker is Kathleen Ditzig. Kat is a curator at National Gallery of Singapore. She received a PhD from the Nanyang Technical University with a dissertation that is very relevant for our symposium. And Kat is coming from New York, from a Rauschenberg Fellowship. Second speaker, So-Yung Lim, is a lecturer at, is an art historian, curator, and lecturer at the Seoul National University. She's also currently a editorial fellow in this project between MMCA and Stedelijk Museum. And among other things, she has co-curated the Guangzhou Biennale, the 13th, right, Guangzhou Biennale. And Koichiro Osaka is a curator, writer, and founding director at Asakusa Space. And Koichiro also has done projects with various institutions such as Eflux and Parasite in Hong Kong. And Koichiro is currently an adjunct assistant professor at the Kyoto University of the Arts. So without further ado, because each panelist gets maximum 30 minutes, I'll pass it over to Kat.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just gonna, the hazards of being short. Is this okay? All right, great. So firstly, I just wanted to thank Miyu Sue, as well as the Goethe Institute and the Documenta Institute for putting this program together. I am very excited to share this research with you. Is this? Okay, great. So I'll be speaking today about the U.S. Cultural Cold War in Southeast Asia, and I'll be talking specifically and broadly about U.S. money in Southeast Asia, specifically through the lens of the 1963 Asian American Assembly. So this is work that has obviously been developed in relation to the different meetings that we've had as part of this program. And it's, so to my fellow participants in the previous program, apologies if you're hearing some of this again. But by way of an introduction, let me introduce you to the Asian American Assembly that was held in Kuala Lumpur in 1963. So the Asian American Assembly was part of the American Assembly, which was founded at Columbia University in 1950 by then General Dwight Eisenhower. Its core work was to hold assemblies of national leaders and actually to publish books on U.S. policy. It became the official administrator of the U.S.'s President's Commission on National Goals, which reported later and then to President Eisenhower in 1960. But in 1963, it organized the first and only Asian American Assembly from April 9th to 12th in Kuala Lumpur in the Federation of Malaya. It brought together actually 60 people, 40 Asian representatives and 20 American representatives. And this number was important. The assembly would always sort of gather 60 people, but the organizers felt that this was the first time that they wanted a very distinctly Asian voice at the assembly, and that voice should outweigh the American voices at the panel, at the assembly. Now, the attendance was specified, meaning it was not open to the public, and who was in that meeting was essentially vetted, selected. You were there if you were essentially part of what is a U.S. Cultural Cold War network. One of the things that was interesting as I was going through their archives was that the names of the people who attended were actually vetted by the different offices of the Asia Foundation, so from across Asia. Names were nominated and so forth. You could bring your wife, but you couldn't bring a friend. So in a sense, the network was very close and specific. And this was important because the gathering of individuals was really to outline the urgencies of cultural exchange. And prior to the meeting in Kuala Lumpur, a collection of papers was actually assembled as part of the second assembly in Harriman, New York, at Arbin House. And it was edited by Robert Bloom, a former president of the Asia Foundation, and at that point, the director of China Policy Studies at the Council for Foreign Affairs. The texts that were put together were background reading for the meeting in Kuala Lumpur, and it laid out actually the fundamentals of American cultural exchange at the moment. I pulled some documents for you about this second 22nd meeting in 1962. So this is before the KL meeting, right? And what I have up here is actually a letter from Ellen Dulles speaking about how important. So Ellen Dulles was the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency at the time. And he was speaking about how important this meeting was for national and international urgencies because there was a need for cultural exchange in peace building, but also that fed into US world building, right? Now, the other thing that's interesting in the letter is that there's Dulles demonstrates an interest at this meeting to meet someone called Harry Whitston, who was then the president of the Asia Foundation. So it's important to note that these meetings were also modes of network building. And so think about that in relation to the Kuala Lumpur meeting. Now, what is interesting about it, and interesting in relation to the discussions we've already had this morning, is something that kind of foreshadows what happens in the post-Cold War period, is the press that responds to this meeting in 1962, prior to the Kuala Lumpur one, that sets essentially the discursive base for the 1963 Kuala Lumpur meeting. It describes, this is a review of it in the literary segment called Culture and the Cold War, and the opening paragraph basically describes what cultural exchange is, and I quote here, that I quote here, where it says, the predominant motives in the race, say, between the United States and the USSR are to capture those, quote, markets in the minds of men which are now opening so rapidly in Asia, India, and Africa. Now, the reason why I point to this and the entire review at this moment is because what we're starting to see already in 1962 is a thinking not just of ideology, but a thinking of a market relationship. So I hold this because my presentation today, as we move through and we think about the Asian American Assembly of 1963, is to think about flows of capital and flows of ideas and how they fit into the art world. Now, the other urgency that was informing the 1962 meeting that became the sort of discursive foundation for the 1963 meeting is that cultural funding and aid from the US after the Marshall Plan had fundamentally shifted by the 60s. This is minutes from that meeting. And basically what it says here is that in the Marshall Plan and Europe of the 1950s was getting a large percentage of the US state budget. By comparison, Africa and Latin America only got 17%. But by the 60s, it was looking at 50% of the state budget. So there was this shift away from Europe to Africa, Latin America, and presumably Asia, why they wanted to do an Asian American Assembly. Now, the 62 Assembly in the US was attended by Christine Jayaratnam Elazir, who was a Ceylonese mathematician from the University of Malaya. He would become the main connector between the American Assembly in Columbia University and the Asian American Assembly in the University of Malaya. It was his responsibility to identify writers, and he eventually identified Sultan Takdir Alijazambana to work with him on a second publication. So what they did was they took the 1962 text where they were thinking about America's cultural exchange. They were thinking about the markets for hearts and minds, and what that type of cultural molding of the world would be. And the second moment for 63 was that they also wanted the Asian thinkers, here represented by Elazir and Alijazambana, to produce a similar parallel publication. Now, this publication was this one here. So this it was published by the University of Malaya and co-sponsored by the American Assembly. And this publication, if we think about this text being brought together with the 1962 text, which was required reading essentially for anyone who attended the assembly, this was really the first time that you see Asian intellectuals and diplomats in a forum talking about cultural exchange, but specifically talking about cultural aid and the role of cultural production, whether it was art, whether it was science and cultural exchange. When it says science and cultural exchange, the important thing to note about Elazir is that he was a mathematician who actually worked with Oppenheimer at one point. So he was also a physicist. So when he's talking about scientific exchange, which you can see in part 2 in his working papers, he's actually talking about those exchanges. And together with Takdir, they talk about art and science and culture together. Essentially what this meeting was and what it represents was an entanglement between cultural producers as well as influences of cultural producers and influential individuals in national and decolonization movements in Asia, as well as a cross-section of what I call the U.S. cultural Cold War complex. Basically, charitable foundations that gave to art, the U.S. State Department, and intelligence organizations. So I just want to hold that for a second. This meeting in 1963 was essentially a meeting of American power, cultural power, state power, as well as financial power, and essentially intellectuals, artists, museum directors, some statesmen, to go into a room and talk about the future of the world and what cultural aid would look like. This is so. I say this and I hold this because I think this assembly hasn't actually been studied. And this is a considerably rare event if you think about what the assembly represented because of its direct ties to the US policymaking at that moment. These were papers that they would publish for greater public knowledge, but these were also directly had the year of the US president. You had the director, deputy directors, the Dulleses attending these events, reading these events. So what we're talking about here is a platform where Asian, and specifically Southeast Asian intellectuals were speaking directly to Cold War power. That being said, in speaking directly to Cold War power, picking up from our comment earlier today about art and the wrappings of economy and the wrappings of discourses around defense when it comes to regionalism, art played an exceptional role in these discussions. So this is the address that opened the assembly, and by the Deputy Prime Minister of the Federation of Malaya. And in it calls out how Malaya is making traveling exhibitions, right? So art actually figures so prominently, not just in the texts that were prepared, but also in the foregrounding of the assembly. The point of almost being part of an international community was the ability to present oneself culturally, to present oneself through exhibitions, through the traveling exhibition. Aesthetic experience in this sense sets the tone for a kind of public life. And it lays a kind of understanding for a possibility of international understanding, but undergirding that is really participation in an international community. So when we think about that, and we think about this as the opening kind of statement, in reality, what was really being discussed at this assembly? What were these two sides of the Cold War, sort of the receiver and the giver, or what we can say is someone seeking to influence and someone engaging with that influence? What kind of world making was being produced? How were Cold War regimes and the context they produced informing cultural production and thus the political production of societies and states? So Takdir actually in his piece responds and sort of addresses this very clearly at the assembly. And we have to think about how radical this is, that this is a statement that's published, but it's also one that is directed essentially to, I have a list later and I'll show you who are some of the key people that attended, but essentially US power. And what Takdir says is this. He says that, with Russian, Chinese, European, American money, Asian countries are forced to create, quote here in the last paragraph, create their own political structure because they can choose from this array. They have to choose, what comes out is essentially the battlefield, or what he calls the battlefield of the two ideologies of the Cold War, creates an opportunity for Asian countries to produce their own political systems, essentially. And these political systems, he's saying, are coming out of cultural funding of art, right? Or the facilitation of art. Now, where does these statements lay, right? And how does this all fit in? So I just put a quick photo up of Elysia as well as Takdir here. And on the right side is a little bit more about Takdir. I pulled that out because Takdir is someone who's who I'm researching deeply. But both of these figures are important, and they actually parallel each other very closely. For example, Elysia essentially works with Robert Oppenheimer at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton in New Jersey in 1955 on an Asia Foundation grant. So the Asia Foundation grew out of the Committee for Free Asia. It was also tied to US intelligence money. He comes to the University of Malaya in 1959, stays there till 1968. And the reason for this is he leaves the University of Colombo because of the prime minister in 1956 coming up at that time on an overtly racist election plank of Sinhale One. So he was basically profiled out of a job. So think of it as the Sinhalese and Tamil ethnicities sort of broke down within that moment of national history. He left, and Malaya became a kind of refuge. And this parallels actually Takdir, because Takdir essentially is at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford on a Rockefeller grant between 59 and 61. He writes essentially what I claim is the first sort of Southeast Asian cybernetics book there. And then he later goes on to the East and West Institute in Hawaii. But he doesn't go back to Indonesia because at that point he is also on a personal sort of exile. He had come into conflict with Sukarno's government and couldn't go back. And the University of Malaya ends up becoming also a space where these post-colonial intellectuals who are part of the US system, or not so much part of the US system, sorry, but receiving money from the US system or having received grants from the US system and are intellectuals that are part of the liberal type of world order building that is associated with the infrastructure, the US Cultural Cold War infrastructure, are finding their way essentially to Malaya and essentially become the two organizers and intellectuals that define the Asian American Assembly. So when we think about this, we have to also think that the Asian American Assembly is a culmination of, it's not just a meeting between the US Cultural Cold War powers or individuals within that system, but also the Southeast Asians and Asians that have engaged with that system productively. So this is actually, we can think of the Asian American Assembly as a culmination of a discursive space, right? And this is a discursive space that goes back into the 50s, early 50s for Takdir, where he works with, so on the right is Confluence, where his work is published by Henry Kissinger when he participates in the Harvard International Seminars. And this network, when we think about the participants, you can't see, but I'll quickly point out, you have Robert Sheeks from the Asia Foundation. He's one of the few Americans who triangulates from Taiwan to KL to Manila, funding the first Southeast Asia Film Festival, as well as early research into Malayanization. You have David Marshall, who's on the Legislative Assembly, who is one of the key actors in negotiating Singapore's self-government in 1959. You have the National Museum of Seoul. You have publishers, you have Takdir. So in a sense, you have a variety of people who are engaged in the region within that space. Now, I am going to move through this now, but to understand what this gathering was and the culmination of this space, I think we have to also understand how we think about the Cultural Cold War as a period and to think specifically about the US Cultural Cold War complex. So the term the Cultural Cold War is distinct, I would say, from Cold War culture. Cold War culture is more anthropological, relating to the less specific but wider ranging concept that everyday social existence may have been shaped by the global dynamic of the Cold War. Instead, when we think about the US Cultural Cold War, we're thinking about the cultural diplomacy between the two blocs and how this coincided and was informed by cultural projects that were parts of decolonization and actually produced a culture, right? So the height of the US Cultural Cold War was really the 1950s, and this was with the establishment of the first forms of US public diplomacy through the creation of the United States Information Agency in 1953, and organizations like the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the Committee of Free Asia in 1950. As I said before, they were both funded by the CIA, but at the same time, you also have the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, that is producing and sending money into the region. One thing you have to keep in mind is that while we're talking about the 50s and the height is really the 50s and 60s, we this, as we noticed earlier, actually starts in the 40s. This is coming out of World War II. So, I mean, just as an aside, when the US government established the CIA in 1947, it included a division known as the Propaganda Assets Inventory, a branch of psychological warfare intended to boost pro-American messaging during the Cold War. But this actually dates back to the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and one of the key thinkers, which anthropologist David Price has written considerably about, is Gregory Bateson, who's also sort of one of your grandfathers of cybernetics. And he talks specifically in 1940 in this essay during World War II that culture has a great deal of influencing, making some people proponently inclined to one view of the world and others to another view. And therefore, it is important we must therefore regard these questions not as questions of human psychology, but rather as questions of human potentiality modified by culture. So the idea that culture can modify worldviews is already coming out of World War II. And specifically, Bateson in 1943 makes an exhibition, Bali, Background to War. I won't go into it, but where he plays out some of these ideas specifically for GIs going into Southeast Asia at the Museum of Modern Art. In 1944, he's in the OSS, and one of his last papers that he writes is a recommendation paper that becomes important for the Cold War because it recommends, if you can see here, the part that's taken out of David Price's recovery of this document, is that you want to encourage exhibition making, because if you encourage exhibition making, you relieve the burden of the native populace rising up against the whites, essentially. That's the argument. Because if you support the cultural expression, this will prevent a native revitalization. And he made other sort of recommendations, but this was one of the key recommendations. And David Price says that these documents were found in CIA archives, not in OSS archives, meaning that these policies were probably taken into effect with the Cold War. So when we start to think about that framework, if we start with, I've done a quick historical period of it, but you can go from the 40s all the way to the 60s. Essentially, from the 50s and 60s, what you have is US money going into the region and artists sort of using that. And this is an interesting thing because I'll give you a couple quick examples. So for example, the first exhibition of Southeast Asian art organized in 1957 by the Art Association of the Philippines was funded actually a lot by the USIS. There was a MoMA exhibition that was included in the center of it. The catalog was printed by the USIS. Some travel budget was provided by Asia Foundation. The Americans didn't, and promotion of it also happened through the Congress of Cultural Freedom. But then at the same time, this is not to say that the Americans had agency, because Porter McRae writes a very complaint letter to the USIS that, hello, I lent you an exhibition, but I don't see my information out there. In a sense, American modernism gets absorbed into Southeast Asian modernism. Now, the other interesting thing that happens off of the back of this is obviously these letters from Asia Foundation. And this is Syed Amit Jamil, who ends up becoming the director for Balai, so the National Gallery in Kuala Lumpur. And he's complaining about the exhibition not being Southeast Asian enough because of who is participating. But his complaint letter is in the Asia Foundation archives because of the money that was provided for travel within the region. So you can see here that essentially whatever American intelligence or American policies were at the time, Southeast Asians were using them to their own end. This is especially true when we look at what happens with Philippine contemporary art, which is the exhibition that grows out of the first Southeast Asian art conference. It basically starts to eat American modernism. Philippine contemporary art incorporating 20th century highlights of American painting. 20th century highlights of American painting is one of the big USIS exhibitions that tried to promote American modernism throughout the world. But instead, what you end up having is a joint show organized by the Art Association of the Philippines, combining their show with American modernism and incorporating it. So eating this modernism in the same way. I would say that this extends even outside the Philippines. You see it as in Singapore when visionary architecture from MoMA is included as a way of promoting public housing in Singapore. Now, the Americans did not pay for this exhibition. They did not understand how it fit into, they did not feel that the MoMA's exhibition of visionary architecture was American enough. And so it ends up being paid for by the Housing Development Board, but gets shown as a way of promoting housing, public housing in Singapore. So I will just say that the prevailing discourse in the US cultural Cold War has always been this sort of idea that New York stole the idea of modern art. But I would posit that if you start to look at the ways in which US capital filtered into Southeast Asia in the 50s and 60s, and you think about the Asian American Assembly of 1963, this narrative is greatly destabilized because obviously Southeast Asians were navigating these systems and producing their own meanings and their own constructions of modernity. I have a lot more that I will not go into, but I will just say one thing before I close is that this system changes. Basically, in 1966, Rampa Art, a left-leaning student magazine, kicks off an expose of intelligence money that is essentially in the system, right? This eventually leads, first, it's actually first about the National Student Associations, but it leads eventually to the Congress for Cultural Freedom being restructured because of the money that's gone into it. In Southeast Asia, it was a big open secret that there was intelligence money. No one sort of, the individuals who are still alive that I've spoken to have called that era the golden age of patronage on some level. They knew what it was. They were navigating those politics. But as with the Asian American Assembly, money is needed for development and projects, and there's a way of navigating those politics. Now, this change, what happens essentially essentially from the 66, 67 period is individuals like Takdir who received a lot of support in the 50s for their intellectual work, going to Stanford and so forth, starts to see from the late 60s onward a difficulty of getting access to this. So these letters between Ralph Tyler and Takdir point to this, because what essentially happens is a lot of funding ends up going into national systems and you have to sort of be nominated. So the networks have shifted by the 60s and 70s. And this fundamentally actually changes the type of worlding that is possible and is taught. And the Asian American Assembly, therefore, in 1963 is a type of bellwether for thinking about the urgencies that come, but also talking that point to strategies that art, it points to actually that artists and cultural producers in Southeast Asia and Asia were quite strategic in the way that they were navigating these spaces and that they had agency, and that they had to move with history, essentially. Okay, I'm going to stop there and hand over to the next. I hope I'm not too far off. Yeah, I can take questions later on the other material, but I would just say that I think that what this lays out and what the Asian American Assembly lays out is the importance of actually looking at capital in relation to cultural production, and how much the pragmatics of looking at capital tell us so much about the building of the political structures in the art world, and that we shouldn't naturally think that because we receive money, let's say from an intelligence organization, that intelligence organization can define the outcomes of the political project at play. And I think across Asia, you see this in the period of the decolonization the intersections of decolonization movements and the Cold War. All right, thank you.
I would also like to thank Yomi and Sue, and also Documenta Institute and Goethe Institute for bringing us all together today. I think I'll echo a lot of what Kathleen has laid out in her presentation, but my focus would be really sort of seeing it through the lens of South Korea. So the title of my presentation today is Networks on Exhibited UNESCO, the Asia Foundation, and Korean Art in Southeast Asia, focusing specifically on the period of 1960 and 61. And I'll be sort of bringing together parts that I have presented in Bandung and in Seoul as part of this project. So conventional analysis of the Cold War tends to privilege its structural binaries, treating geopolitical conflict as a fixed and oppositional system. Yet such frameworks, as we've been talking, risk flattening the cultural and political complexity of the period, overlooking the multilateral and often improvised infrastructures that enable transnational movement. This presentation shifts focus away from Cold War bipolarity and instead examines the underlying mechanisms, both official and unofficial, that facilitated cultural exchange across Asia in the early 1960s. By tracing how exhibitions, artistic networks, and institutional affiliations operated through dispersed and contingent channels, I aim to rethink the early years of Cold War through the lens of networked mobilization. Building on this approach, I turn to the case of South Korean artists who, between 1960 and 61, traveled as a group throughout East and Southeast Asia, organizing touring exhibitions and conferences, attempting to form what they envisioned as an Asia Artist International Association. I focus on this case study not because the alliance succeeded, but precisely because it did not. Its incompletion allows us to examine the ambitions, entanglements, and limitations of cultural networking in a region caught between ideological pressures and subnational dynamics. It also offers an important counterpoint to dominant narratives of South Korea's participation in Cold War-era culture exchange, which have largely centered on its engagements with the United States or its presence in Western biennials. Instead, this history asks us to reconsider how South Korea, as a Cold War ally of the US, also interacted with other Asian states, not merely as a passive recipient of Western cultural aids or a staging ground for ideological projection, but as an active participant in constructing inter-Asian circuits. On March 4th, 1960, the Asian Artists International Association Charter was published, which is the one that you just saw. In Joseonilbo, Korea's most widely read newspaper, making the public culmination of two major expeditions across Southeast Asia by a group of practicing artists from South Korea. What is both interesting and noteworthy is that the idea and funding for forming this regional artistic alliance were initiated and proposed by Taiwan, then known as the Republic of China, with backing from UNESCO and the Asia Foundation, though the actual activities for promoting participation was carried out by the South Koreans. In the beginning of 1960, upon an invitation of the Taiwanese government, and more specifically its Fine Art Association, South Korea's White Sun Group, also known as Baekhyanghoe, a collective of 9 prominent artists devoted to revitalizing and internationalizing Oriental painting, organized a touring exhibition of the group's contemporary ink paintings through Taipei and Hong Kong. Central to this exchange was the collaboration between the Korean and Taiwanese art circle, including artists such as Tian Menxi, an ink painter native of Henan province who had studied at the University of Arts in Munich and later from Wonkwang University in South Korea. Tian's visit to Korea in 1959, facilitated by the Korean National Commission of UNESCO, laid the foundation for deeper artistic engagement. The success of the exhibition in Taipei, which featured around 1960 works by members of the group, attracted notable figures such as scholar, calligrapher, and politician Yu Yoren, as well as Song Meiling, First Lady of the Republic of China. It also led to the unprecedented acquisition of Kim Young-gi's painting, Impressions of the Highland, by Taiwan's National Museum of History. Shown here are works by Bang Rui-yeon, and these are the exhibition photographs, one of the most prominent female ink painters of the time. She traveled to Taiwan with the group alongside her partner, Kim Gi-chang, then the country's most foremost figure in Oriental painting. And here you see Park and Kim presenting a picture album as a gift to Song Meiling. After spending at least a week in Kaohsiung and other parts of the island creating life drawings, the White Sun Group traveled to Hong Kong in March, where they exhibited at St. John's Cathedral under the invitation of the Hong Kong Chinese Art Club, an established association of contemporary calligraphers and ink painters founded by Li Fengong. While it is unsurprising that South Korea engaged in cultural exchanges with anti-communist states like Taiwan and Hong Kong during this period, such exchanges were made possible by figures like Kim Young-gi, known by his pen name Kim Gi-chang, who played a pivotal role as a cultural mediator. Kim had studied in Beijing in the early 1930s under the renowned painter Chi Bai-shi, and upon returning to post-war South Korea, he quickly emerged as a leading voice in ink painting and as the co-founder of the White Sun Group. Fluent in Mandarin and equipped with international experience, Kim was uniquely positioned to build networks with overseas Chinese artists across Asia. It was therefore Kim Young-gi who effectively formed and led the 5-member Southeast Asia visiting group later that year. This initiative served as the first major preparatory step towards realizing Taiwan's ambitious 1960 proposal to establish an association of Asian artists aimed at fostering cultural solidarity amongst anti-communist nations in the region and supporting the development of each country's contemporary artistic practice. So under Kim's leadership, the group was tasked with organizing a mobile exhibition of contemporary South Korean art and official talks across 8 cities, as you see outlined here, beginning in Taipei and continuing through Manila, Saigon, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Phnom Penh, Bangkok, and Hong Kong, before concluding in Tokyo. The project was mainly financed by international aid organizations such as UNESCO and the Asia Foundation, and while it's not entirely clear how the places were chosen, it's telling that the trip included countries such as the Philippines and Thailand, and South Vietnam, which were former allies of the United States, either serving as members of SEATO or hosting American military bases, and others that were facing challenging circumstances, either battling with communism or seeking to keep a policy of neutrality. While the exact amount supported by each of the international organizations for this particular trip remains unknown, the structure of interregional collaboration and support enacted by the different national commissions of UNESCO in Asia is worth exploring. Unlike many other national commissions directly embedded within government ministries, Korean National Commission of UNESCO, hereafter KCNU, was established as an autonomous body shortly after South Korea's official entry into UNESCO in 1950, which granted it significant control over its own programs, finances, and staffing. Considering that South Korea was able to enter the United Nations membership only as late as in 1991, it's not difficult to imagine the prestige and influence UNESCO held over the nation, which is reflected by the founding of UNESCO House in Central Seoul and the inaugural publication of Korea Journal, both in 1960. But more importantly, the network of national commissions of UNESCO in Asia that supported the South Korean artist delegations should be understood within the broader shift in the organization's regional strategy. Known as the Major Project on the Mutual Appreciation of Eastern and Western Cultural Values, launched in 1956, it was the first and largest hands-on endeavor by an international organization to improve understanding of diverse cultural values, and therefore to encourage each of its national branches to form a more institutionalized, long-term collaboration. While the East-West division, most commonly thought of in 1956, was that between the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective allies, the UNESCO project focused on the cultural values of Asian and European civilizations. The project, and I quote, outlined East and West not as entities in themselves, but as the two halves of a whole, which were definable only in terms of the ideas they held about each other. Even though the concept of East and West were acknowledged by experts to be too simplistic and vague, the terms attracted popular interest, fueled by images of a spiritually rich East and composed of Asian and Arab states, and a technologically driven West, represented by Europe and North America, unquote. And yet the issue of representing China and its culture remained a highly sensitive and challenging matter for UNESCO since the People's Republic of China founding in 1949. This was despite the fact that the ROC under Kuomintang was a founding member of UNESCO and had played an important role in its early formation. supported in part by Joseph Needham, UNESCO's first head of natural sciences, whose wartime collaboration with Chinese scientists and Kuomintang officials helped shape UNESCO's vision of international scientific cooperation. Taiwan was able to retain China's seat at UNESCO until 1971 and also in UN, despite the PRC's objections, but this caused a diplomatic deadlock. In other words, UNESCO's support for Taiwan and its ambition to form an international alliance of Asian artists most likely had to be done more covertly and in a nuanced way, hence their invitation of South Korean artists to carry out the explicit diplomatic role. As Kathleen has already outlined, under the leadership of Robert Bloom, the CIA-backed Asia Foundation similarly underwent a significant strategic shift in the 1950s and early 1960s, moving away from direct propaganda towards a decentralized model of cultural diplomacy. Rather than promoting a single ideological message, the foundation focused on building a network of partnerships with local elites, intellectuals, and artists, allowing them to reinterpret or adapt Western knowledge to suit their own cultural context. This approach aligned with Bloom's belief that US influence would be more effective if embedded within indigenous institutions rather than imposed externally. The Asia Foundation's support for the Asian Artists International Association epitomized this strategy. Instead of using artists to push overt anti-communist messaging, the Asia Foundation backed exhibitions that fostered regional artistic exchange and visualized ideological alignment through aesthetic and diplomatic nuance. However, as many cultural historians have already pointed out, the tension never ceased between soft power's aspirational pluralism and the strategic aims it was ultimately meant to serve, making theory much easier than practicing it. And here you see how the Asia Foundation's investment into the visual arts program really expanded in the mid-1950s. Just like UNESCO, the Committee for Free Asia, the Asia Foundation's predecessor, also established national branches across Asia, including Tokyo, Manila, Taipei, in the early 1950s, which also partly explains the itinerary of the Southeast Asia visiting group. In any case, it wasn't an exception for the national branches of Asia Foundation to support alongside the national commissions of UNESCO, just as both of the South Korean branches had co-funded several projects, including the 1959 Free Art Invitational Exhibition and Park So-bo's participation in UNESCO's International Association of Plastic Arts in Paris. As illustrated here, Park was able to stay in Paris for an extended period of time thanks to the financial aid provided by the foundation. In stark contrast to the enthusiastic support demonstrated by the international organizations, the South Korean government offered minimal diplomatic or financial assistance to the group. In fact, their tour unfolded at a time of intense domestic turmoil. Syngman Rhee's authoritarian regime had just collapsed following the April Revolution of 1960, ushering in the short-lived Second Republic under Changmyeon, which was soon overturned by Park Chung-hee's military coup in May 1961. Amid this political instability, cultural diplomacy was clearly not a state priority. Kim Young-gi later expressed frustration over the lack of backing from his own government, especially when compared to the warm receptions and institutional support the group received throughout the travel abroad. Now that I have roughly outlined how the idea for Asia Artists Association came about, I'd like to focus on the Southeast Asia visiting group that actually carried out the role of promoting it. Formed in December 1960, the group was composed of 5 members selected to represent different artistic disciplines. Kim Young-gi, representing Oriental painting or ink painting, Kim Kyung-seung, sculpture, Kwon Young-hyu, design, on the far right, Lee Wan-seok, crafts, and Kim Suryeon, Western painting. Unlike the earlier Taiwan visit in February, which focused solely on ink painting and the members of the White Sun Group, this delegation was structured to showcase the breadth of Korean art made by contemporary artists. Most members were affiliated with the Korean Fine Arts Association. Kim Young-gi, fluent in Chinese, in Mandarin, and a key figure in earlier Taiwan exchanges, led the group, while Kim Suryeon replaced the originally intended female artist Chun Kyung-ja to maintain gender representation. Lee Won-sok, though not a full-time artist, was selected for his administrative expertise and curatorial sensibility. Kwon Young-hyu, who had prior experience designing exhibitions such as The Family of Men that toured in Seoul in 1957, likely oversaw the display design for the traveling exhibition. The exhibition included around 150 works, mostly flat, two-dimensional works on paper, including photographs and reproductions of sculptures created by the leading members of various artists' associations active in South Korea at the time. These are the list of the associations that have been reported to have taken part. As you can see in the image, when possible, the works were framed and hung, but in certain cases, they had to be simply rolled out and hastily displayed along empty walls. Since the time is limited, I won't go through the details of each visit, but focus on a few notable instances. So the tour began with a major exhibition at the National Museum of History in Taipei, and an official standoff by Taiwanese officials and artists in December 1960. Press coverage compiled by the museum reflects strong local enthusiasm for forming an anti-communist network of Asian artists. However, I'd also like to argue that at least for Kim Young-gi, the tour was not purely about ideology or cultural diplomacy. It was also a response to the declining relevance of Oriental painting in South Korea. As Western modernism and abstract art rose in prominence after the Korean War, traditional ink painters were gradually losing the ground and opportunities to take part in international events. Kim most likely saw engaging with contemporary subjects and participating in regional exchange as a way to revitalize ink painting and reassert its relevance within a changing art world, particularly by showcasing it on equal footing with abstract painting, photography, craft, and design, thereby framing it as a contemporary medium rather than merely a traditionalist one. In Manila, the first stop after Taiwan, the exhibition was held from January 3rd to 6th, 1961, at the National Museum of the Philippines. The opening drew key figures as Geronima Paxson, the first woman to serve as UNESCO's executive board and long-serving chair of the Philippine National Commission of UNESCO, Purita Calao Ledesma, founder of the Art Association of the Philippines, Eduardo Quisenbring, director of the National Museum and the Korean ambassador. Reporting back to Chosunilbo a few days after the opening, Kim Young-gi wrote, "The exhibition attracted notable public interest despite taking place during the New Year holiday." He recalled that visitors were particularly intrigued by the Korean alphabet Hangul calligraphy, a form they did not have themselves. Then this is what he mentions in his writing. And ink paintings, which they refer to as watercolor. According to him, a meeting with Filipino artists was also held on January 5th to discuss forming a pan-Asian art exhibition network. Over 30 attendees agreed to cooperate and signed on the spot. However, local reception seems to have been a mixed one. In the following year, the Manila Times would refer to that event as a lesser Korean art exhibit, downplaying its significance compared to a larger Korean exhibition that followed the year after. In places like Singapore, the delegation could not rely on official diplomatic or intergovernmental support. Instead, assistance came through the local Korean diaspora and private enterprise, most notably from entrepreneur Kim Yong-duk of Shinheung Trading Corporation. Kim played a pivotal role establishing connections with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce in Singapore, where both of the visiting groups' exhibitions and talks were held. To give a little more description about the company, Shinheung first had its headquarters in Saigon. Then they had an outpost in Singapore, acting as one of the first exporters of Korean seafood and other goods to Southeast Asia. By 1963, the company would launch a new timber business with a US loan guaranteed by the South Korean government. It employed former Korean military engineers and over 100 local workers in Borneo to harvest wood, which were shipped to South Korea and later exported to the US as plywood. Elsewhere in Kuala Lumpur, the Straits Times reported that the exhibition received raving reviews in Singapore, and the visiting South Korean artists had an opportunity to interact with local artists in Frank Sullivan's house, and even meet Thailand's sculptor Kian Yimsiri. And the list goes on, and there are news clippings from each of the sites that they held the exhibition and the talks. These were reports from Saigon. As you can see, local newspapers, English language dailies, and several Mandarin language outlets covered the group's visit and their activities. Notably, those such as Nanyang Xingpo and Sinchujipo, both established in the early 1920s by prominent Chinese business figures, reported not only on the exhibition itself or the visit, but the group's proposal to form a regional network of Asian artists. Not surprisingly, these newspapers, which primarily served the overseas Chinese communities in the Malay region, highlighted both cultural significance of the visit and its connection to broader anti-communist cooperation efforts in the region. Yet despite the ambitions shared by all parties involved in the formation of the Asian Artists International Association, and the enthusiasm expressed by local artists, newspapers, and international institutions during the group's visit, the project ultimately did not come to fruition. After returning to South Korea, Kim Young-gi and his group held a review exhibition in June, but no further steps were taken to implement the initiatives outlined in the charter shown at the very beginning of this presentation. The artists each returned to their individual careers, and the momentum dissipated. Perhaps because of this anticlimactic conclusion, the intense cultural exchanges mediated by South Korean artists have largely been overlooked so far, or framed simply as efforts to promote and internationalize Korean art. By rendering visible the unexpected network forged by the artists of the 1960s, I hope this case study can complicate our understanding of inter-Asian Cold War cultural and diplomatic dynamics, revealing a more layered and contingent history of regional and cultural engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Miyu Suwei, Documentary Institute and Goethe Institute for this valuable opportunity. I'm especially grateful to Goethe Institute Kyoto for supporting during the traveling workshop last year and now in Kassel. I'd like to start with the signature of one diplomat. That is the focus of my talk today. The signature of Nagakage Okabe, as you see on the left, appears in this imperial cabinet record dated June 1943. That was his first attendance as a Minister of Education under Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who happened to be Okabe's classmates at the elementary school. More than a mere diplomatic trace, the signature offers an index of affective comportment. His measured, proportioned, and deliberately unadorned brushwork avoid expressive flourish, favoring instead a tightly disciplined rhythm. Compared to the bolder, more assertive signatures of Tojo and Commerce Minister Nobusuke Kishi, Okabe's handwriting conveys restrained introspection and silent ethos of bureaucratic life. Okabe was a Viscount, diplomat, a cultural policymaker, and bureaucrat. In this talk, I discuss Okabe's career, centering on his post-war institutional role in the 1950s, while tracing his roots in interwar cultural diplomacy. His early involvement in Japan-China cultural projects in 1923, at age 39, marked the onset of bureaucratic modality that would shape his approach to cultural governance across regimes. He would later serve as Minister of Education during the last years of the Pacific War, before becoming imprisoned in 1945 as a suspected Class B war criminal. Following his release from the purge, he was appointed in 1955 at age 67 as the first director of National Museum of Modern Art, Tokyo. He later served as the chairperson of the Society for International Cultural Relations, KBS, now known as the Japan Foundation. Okabe is a discrete figure who has remained largely absent from art historical scholarship, reflecting the general perception of museum directors in Japan as often seen as politicians rather than their curatorial leadership. Yet his career discloses the foundational undercurrents of post-war cultural formation, where delegated authority, procedural choreography, and institutional calibration formed the operative terrain where bureaucratic scripting and curatorial visibility intersect. So cultural policy had long been entangled in the labor of political repair. Within Japan's Ministry of Education, Foreign Affairs, the idea that cultural initiatives might function as a form of reparation as an ethical counterbalance to imperial aggression began to form while the launch of the Japan-China Cultural Project. So that was initiated by Asia Pacific Bureau within the ministry where Okabe belonged. In the context of 1923, however, the objective was not restitution for military violence, but the careful use of leftover indemnity funds from Qing Dynasty China under the Boxer Protocol in a manner that mitigates anti-Japanese sentiment. Okabe played a pivotal role in initiating and administrating this project, which encompassed a broad range of programs, including the establishment of research institutes and libraries in Beijing and Shanghai, tuition subsidies, preparatory education program for Chinese students studying in Japan. Significantly, these projects were financed not only through the leftover indemnity funds, but also other redirected revenues from railway facilities and Chinese government bonds, exemplifying how formal diplomatic mechanisms were reframed as civilizational projects, masking asymmetrical power relations beneath the language of cultural advancement. Now, existing memoranda from this period find Okabe's acute awareness of rising anti-Japanese sentiment across China in response to the expanding cultural initiatives. A report from Shanghai found among Okabe's documents voiced strong opposition to the Japan-China Culture Project, denouncing them as a form of a cultural imperialism disguised as diplomacy. The report likened these initiatives to earlier exploitative use of Chinese reparations, such as Japan's construction of military facilities following the First Sino-Japanese War, and the notion that such projects could be reframed as cultural or educational, and it accused Japan of repurposing funds from Chinese indemnities to extend ideological influence and criticized Tokyo's refusal to acknowledge these activities as a legitimate return of reparations. Okabe, while gesturing towards sympathy, dismissed the project as absurd to the point of ridicule and called the critics as proponents of exclusionary thinking. He insisted that cultural initiative must not serve as instrument of diplomacy and should remain entirely separate from immediate political concerns. The concept of affective silence becomes particularly resonant in reading of Okabe's maneuvers. Despite advocating for a cultural project separate from political concerns, the selective silence in his administrative records underscores how bureaucratic documentation serves both to archive and disregard opposing statements. So his writing express clear antagonism towards what he identifies as anti-Japanese movement supported by the Soviet-backed Comintern. Paradoxically, though he advocated for the separation of cultural work from political instrumentalization, Okabe simultaneously endorsed cultural operations, which he later termed as cultural struggle, as necessary to secure, I quote, the flourishing of East Asia and their partnership. So this rhetorical contradiction reveals tension inherent in his bureaucratic position, simultaneously sympathetic and antagonistic, negotiating atmospheres of geopolitical anxieties. Okabe's assertions navigated cultural engagement and diplomacy, increasingly reflecting Pan-Asian nationalist rhetoric, carefully modulating language across regimes. Although Okabe's early project led to the establishment of the Society for International Cultural Relations, which is, as I said, a precursor to Japan Foundation, which was initially distinct from explicit propaganda efforts like the Imperial Art Association. But it saw a significant realignment. By 1940, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had ceded the authority of KBS, which is the organization that I'm mentioning, to the Cabinet Intelligence Bureau, effectively integrating KBS into state-led propaganda. So this period marked a crucial juncture where artistic landscape narrowed, promoting Nihonga, which is Japanese-style painting, together with Pan-Asianist ideology and regional conservatism. So exhibitions such as this one in Vietnam in 1942, catalyzed by a tripartite pact and Japan's invasion of French Indochina, exemplified these dynamics. Ironically, Okabe's visionary initiatives ultimately become integrated into the abstract military vision of the Greater East Asia prosperity sphere. When Okabe returned to public office after 7 years of purge, now we're talking about 1951 specifically, as a museum director, he occupied a singular position, one capable of mediating between the authority of the cabinet and the aesthetic sphere of the gallery. The prevailing narrative in curatorial history credited Chief Curator Atsuo Imaizumi, then the visible face of the institution, with initiating the post-war museum's visual language, one that embodied ideals of democracy and international exchange. It is true, according to multiple stakeholder interviews, that these early exhibitions were driven by the energy and initiative by those working on the ground. At the same time, diplomatic records suggest that the New York-centered curatorial trajectory had been scripted even before Imaizumi's appointment. So these two dynamics, grassroots curatorial agency and pre-structured diplomatic influence, were not mutually exclusive. Rather, they appeared to have unfolded in tandem. So how do we situate this emergence of the Cold War mechanism, not only in the geopolitical dynamics, but within the very material infrastructures of ideologically charged exhibition spaces? A Museum of Modern Art Tokyo stands out as a pivotal site. It might be insightful at this point to consider the very setting of the new museum itself. Kitanomaru Park, adjacent to the Imperial Palace. So Shojiro Ishibashi, a key figure in Japanese cultural engagement and sponsor of the Japan Pavilion at the Venice Biennial, agreed to fund the museum on the condition it be sited there. A gesture framed as a, quote, deep respect for both the imperial family and the arts. So this site, once restricted from development by cabinet decision, thus became a symbolically charged location tied to imperial representation and post-war reconstruction. So yet this reverence should not be read merely as personal sentiment, nor should the museum site be interpreted as an expression of imperial continuity. Rather, it signals a more complex strategy, a selective reoccupation of imperial proximity under the disguise of cultural rehabilitation. So in this view, the museum site becomes less a continuation of the past than re-inscription of bureaucratic legitimacy through spatial alignment with imperial iconography without fully reactivating its ideological core. This strategic ambiguity, framed as sight as effectively charged, managing imperial residues within post-war national pride. The museum's location thus appear as palimpsest, layered with unresolved contradiction, nationalist aspirations, imperial residue, diplomatic projection, and domestic conservatism. One of the clearest records of the cabinet gallery interface is a closed-door meeting held in 1957, the first expert gathering on cultural diplomacy, convened by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Though not publicized at that time, this session brought together 20 influential industrialist collectors and political figures, including Ishibashi, the donor of the museum, and Okabe, in order to exchange thoughts on state culture diplomacy, aiming at informal consensus at the cabinet level. The meeting was chaired by Nobusuke Kishi, then holding the dual positions of foreign minister and prime minister, and the meeting was scheduled in time for his visit to Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, with an agenda of war reparation through economic support and cultural exchanges. The session began with a 5-point policy. First, promotion of cultural exchange with free world nations. And second, the strengthening of ties with Southeast Asian countries. So these points align with Japan's Cold War era official policy, particularly the emphasis on war reparation and regional engagement. So following the Bandung Conference in 1955, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs articulated the country's broad stance, maintaining contact and interest in rising nationalism in the 1950s in Southeast Asia, while maintaining to prevent communism in the region, with Japan's position being a member of the free world, emphasizing economic cooperation and cultural exchange over political engagement. The expert meeting aimed to realize these government directives through voluntary exchanges with other organizations and private sectors, yet concluded without immediate outcomes. In tracing the thread between the cabinet and the gallery, how can we meaningfully distinguish between curatorial judgment and cabinet-level decision-making, between the act of selecting artworks and the appointment of curators and architects, or even the exhibition sites? In both domains, visibility is managed. Cultural meaning is shaped through the often invisible discretion of bureaucratic structures. The gallery viewed through this lens does not stand apart from the mechanism of statecraft. It is where the protocol of policy and politics at display become entangled. The exhibition program at MoMAT, the Museum of Modern Art Tokyo, in early 1950s revealed this dual logic. On one hand, there was a stream of exhibitions developed through collaboration with local critics and artists, such as the museum's inaugural exhibition, Modern Japanese Art, a retrospective of a modern painting, which offered reflective overview of Western-style painting and Nihonga, a Japanese-style painting, framing modern Japanese art within national and historical continuity, or today's focus, these two exhibitions on the slide, today's focus on the history of Japanese art and then on the history of Asian art, assembled pre-modern works from China, India, Southeast Asia. The curatorial statement for the show explicitly positioned MoMAT as offering a curatorial historiography distinct from Euro-American models, where the goal to propose the positioning of Japanese artistic modernity within an aesthetic narrative across broader Asian cultural heritage. At the same time, another set of exhibitions reflected the growing influence of the state-led international diplomacy. These included return exhibitions of Japan contributions to São Paulo and Venice Biennial, both coordinated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The 1953 Japan-USA photography exhibition curated by Edward Steichen of Photography Department of MoMA, New York, and initiatives such as Tokyo International Print Biennial, where Nobusuke Kishi, then the central figure in foreign policy, was heading the honorary committee. So among these exhibitions, one exhibition stands out for its hybrid nature. The Japan-USA Abstract Exhibition of 1955. So this show marked the juncture where the two strands, autonomous curatorial initiative and bureaucratic diplomacy, were not only present, but consciously intertwined. The exhibition was organized in collaboration between the American Abstract Artists Association and the museum team. The exhibition was structured according to a bifurcated spatial logic. Visitor first encounter works by American artists and then proceeded to view Japanese works, with a transitional zone in the middle where pieces from both nations were intermingled. A definitive feature of the installation was the inclusion of avant-garde calligraphy alongside abstract painting. Rather than treating calligraphy as a separate, culturally distinct genre, the exhibition staged it within the continuum of abstraction, whereby challenging modernist hierarchies and proposing an expanded field of formal experimentation. The treatment of space further supported this reconfiguration. The scenography developed by architect Kenzo Tange included a bed of sand bounded by rope, invoking the spatial grammar of the dry garden. On the upper floor, material historically associated with, I don't know if you can see from this picture, but on the wall is the paper that is historically associated with folding screens and the interiors of tea room, invoking, where the Japanese works were shown. So these sorts of painting by Japanese artists on the third floor, and then the wall are kind of textured with this special paper used for folding screens. So this interplay between wall material and pictorial mark foregrounded the material intelligence of abstraction, aligning gestural modernism with traditional techniques of display. From Okabe's vantage point, as a former bureaucrat navigating the charged terrain of post-war cultural re-entry, the exhibition may have constituted more than a formalist dialogue between two nations. It staged a constructive narrative of aesthetic equivalence, one that sought to align Japanese abstraction with American-centric modernism, while asserting a distinct lineage grounded in East Asian visual culture. So the Japan-USA Abstract Exhibition thus operated not merely as a diplomatic gesture, but as a visual strategy for reinscribing Japan's modernism through the idiom of abstraction within the museum space that was itself still negotiating its ideological coordinates. As much as the exhibition reflected the interest of the curatorial team, it also resonated with Okabe's long-standing vision for the museum. As one former curator at MoMAT remarked in a 2001 interview, the opening of the museum felt like a kind of festival. So many people gathered, there was none of the smell of bureaucracy. While the interviewees spoke admiringly of his senior curator, Imaizumi, there existed another register of influence, less conspicuous, but no less structurally formative, the presence of Okabe. What appeared on surface as a youthful celebration of post-war artistic freedom may have been in part a mediated event. Imaizumi, in a poignant article in the museum bulletin mourning Okabe's passing, noted Okabe's presence felt like a weight bearing down socially as well. Okabe operated as a bureaucratic interlocutor whose role was less about authoring exhibitions than about scripting the institutional conditions under which exhibition could take place. as a transitional figure who moved between pre-war imperial administration, wartime propaganda, infrastructure, and post-war cultural reconstruction, Okabe occupied a liminal but powerful position, mobilizing policy, institutional memory, and diplomatic resources, while sustaining a longer historical vision of culture's place in the modern state. So in conclusion, in this research, I explored how bureaucratic scripting, rather than straightforward repair, shaped a post-war cultural landscape. Such efforts were neither ideologically coherent. Rather, it reframed past ruptures with a new institutional context. Figures like Okabe did not simply manage transitions. In effect, they rearranged conditions in which contradictions between imperial residue, democratic display, and between curatorial autonomy and state scripting could coexist without resolution. Bureaucracy in this light emerges not only as a passive executor of policy, but an effective and procedural apparatus, staging coherence while navigating the fractures beneath. What was being repaired then was not the past itself, but the legitimacy of the past. Imperial state sought through exhibition, appointment, and cultural forms that encoded both continuity and disavowal. Cultural institutions such as MoMAT, the Museum of Modern Art Tokyo, did not simply absorb Cold War ideology. Their emergence was shaped through their administrative textures, moral ambiguities, procedural deferrals, and choreographed silences that rendered bureaucracy a contested medium of political repair. So can bureaucracy function as an agent of cultural repair in the aftermath of imperial collapse and war? How might we read exhibition not only as a cultural expressions, but also as performative spaces where Cold War geopolitics, affective silence, and unresolved sense of responsibilities converge? Ultimately, such repair resides less in symbolic gestures than in the prolonged choreography of effectively mediated bureaucracy, subtle convergences of emotion, policy, and institutional memory. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I was just saying to Kat that, after the third time, I get a little bit better at comprehending all the complexities and also at my own notes taking. So don't feel too embarrassed if you're not getting the gist of of it or any part of it. I think each of the presentations can be unpacked for another hour. Each of the figures that you evoke is there are volumes of books written on them. So I think it's really is extremely rich. But let me maybe just try to hover above the whole field a little bit to highlight some of the things that are perhaps common or patterns that reoccur. I feel there's a almost recurring invocation of the region, and the region can be sometimes Asia. I mean, we spoke with Priya this morning about Asianism also in the Indian context. So it could be Asia, it could be Southeast Asia, and I wonder if that's the moments that we're looking at are interesting and more conducive for this kind of sometimes almost claims on the region without having any substance backing it or without having worked through the, what exactly it means, because this is the moment when nationalism was still quite nascent in many of the nations, right? And including in some of the moments we looked at, some of the countries as we know them today, they still do not exist as such. So, so looking and that could be, you can take it into many different directions. You can have a sort of understanding of Asia, Southeast Asia, that is essentially based on traditional cultures, as some of the proponents do. I know this in the painter or in the discourses on art, but also sort of as a philosophical proposition or, against the tech-driven West. But then you can also use it to your own advantage, and I think this it comes up a lot in Takdir, the figure that Kat investigates, who already had an understanding of Southeast Asia having its own political system or entity, and this is way before ASEAN as an organization has come about. So he probably is really the sort of, the unappointed diplomat for ASEAN, or no, for Asia, for Southeast Asia, and doing that really ahead of time. But then at the same time, I think I have to ask to all of the figures and all of the moments when the region was evoked, to which extent it is actually the region, or is it another name for nationalism, right? So we have this interesting conversation about Takdir, whose understanding of the region is actually more an understanding of Indonesia, according to some of his ex-colleagues, perhaps intellectual opponents. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is tied to this regionalism or regions, various claims of the region, which is tradition. And this thing is not sitting very well, that's why. And I think perhaps, and this is really zooming out, because I feel if you go through discourses of liberalism, right? The way that it had gone through the West has actually Western Europe, America has gone through it. There are always those moments when you consider very, very seriously about the traditions, right? And all these values. And I feel Asian, being Southeast Asia, maybe also South Asia, I think being sort of late adopters, latecomers to the game of having to learn to be in this liberal international post-war order, like by the U.S. In most of the parts that we looked at right now. Maybe there's a sort of repetition of that going on. So traditionalism, and as part of a broader liberal learning process, and then how it intersects with the various versions of the region, either Asia or Southeast Asia. And then this is not really a question. I want to start with Kat, maybe with a very precise question, because you skipped a lot of slides. And because you promised to speak about money. And I think that the slides are about money, and it would be quite nice to give us just the gist of that.
What you're asking me is actually the second part of my presentation, which is what happens after Rampart, what happens after the transformation of capital in some senses. And the second part of my presentation actually looks at banking, specifically looking at Chase Manhattan's bank movement into Southeast Asia, which was actually, they're known internationally, and they're now known as the J.P. Morgan Art Collection as one of the most sort of respected corporate collections. David Rockefeller started collecting in 1959, if I'm not wrong. But he sets up, or Chase Manhattan Bank moves into Singapore in 1963, and that becomes a kind of regional base. Interestingly, it moves into Colombia 1964. So there's this internationalizing that happens around banking in the 1960s. And when that happens, they also start to acquire local collections. So this is, so I kind of point to that because the Chase Manhattan ends up taking an important role in showing a lot of modern artists in Southeast Asia. Some of the cases I have were from Indonesia, but this was also cases in Singapore, where later, after ties up with the United Overseas Bank, there's a lot of references to Chase's collection. Just as an aside, the Chase collection is still on show at JP Morgan in Singapore. So unlike a lot of other collections. A lot of collections were deaccessioned. A lot of collections that were built up were deaccessioned during the Asian financial crisis. This is one that's still kind of around. So the reason why I brought that up is because those collections predate sort of the building of national collections when we look at the 70s. Though, of course, Chase is buying also in the 70s in Singapore, Southeast Asia. And when we start to look at those flows of capital, that artists start to sell work, and that's a shift away from the state-driven model, right? Of, let's say, what artists from the period and receivers of these sort of funds from the Asia Foundation, Ford Foundation, have told me. So this actually comes from specifically an interview I did with Lim Cheong Kiat. He called it the golden age of patronage. When that golden age kind of changed in the 70s, it seemed like private players and corporations played a larger role, and Chase was an example. And this becomes interesting when we start thinking about when American modernism starts to show up in Southeast Asia. Because I think it's quite different, the history with Japan a bit, because we get prints, we get reproductions, there's a whole history around that. And I have work on that, which I'm happy to share for those interested. But it comes back in the late 70s and 80s when there starts to be a market for these types of things. And so this is interesting because you mentioned when you were introducing me that I would just spent the last week in New York doing research with the Robert Rauschenberg Archives and Foundation. And I was interviewing dealers from this period, and that they had said something explicitly happens towards the 80s and 90s, so towards the end of the Cold War, which is this move from art business to art market. So to circle back, and I'm sorry for this long answer, Miu, is when I mentioned that the press in 1962 talks about the market for hearts and minds, actually, I think that already foreshadows what is coming out of the end of the Cold War into the post-Cold War, which is essentially the transformation of thinking about ideas and politics around the idea of markets and capital. And this feeds back into your idea of regionalism, because ASEAN as a framework is also, I think, so successful because it's framed around markets as well. Like, what is a shared market in that sense? Does that answer your question about capital?
I mean, I think this is another research, but basically, my suspect would be that the banks also process aid money, right? So aid, and that totally plays into the same. You started out looking at a conference when cultural players speaking to politicians, right?
Yeah.
Quite explicitly,
Yeah.
having that in mind,
Yeah.
asking for demanding for cultural aid, right? So there's a whole question of the aid through culture, but actually aid, development aid.
There were bankers at that meeting too, actually, as well. So yes, but
Good.
less visible in the archive. So less
Yeah.
comment there, but they were there. Yeah.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
I sort of want to highlight, because I know Maria is sitting here, and also we're at Documenta Institute, and in Koichiro's research, there's always this moment of, Japan and Germany, sharing certain, say, similar conditions, right, as after the Second World War. So of course, our case study is all around us, Documenta. And it does feel like there's some of the patterns are there, such as when you have a local actor. In your case, it's Kenzo Tenge, right? This architect who designed the abstract show, and then just really wanted to put a dry garden in it, right? So it's like, for me, it's really quite an interesting moment of local pride. You have your own interpretation for it as a visual strategy, and we can certainly ruminate on some kind of, again, this kind of traditional values, whatever. But I feel it's also a local pride that you can identify in some moments in Documenta's own history, right? So it's not always, the MoMA curators could all of a sudden export U.S. cultural products to Germany, to West Germany, in the 50s. But actually, the locals had their own pride, and at some point wanted to push back. But whether they have achieved it or not. Maybe it's too early to tell. Yeah, so I want to see if there's anyone also from the audience wanting to, maybe break more lines of light into.
Regarding Kathleen's case study, you said it was not a secret in Southeast Asia where money came from and that was taken, I don't know, maybe lightly, but not without big worries. But what about the United States? I try to imagine what civil society said. On the one hand, there's a major war in Vietnam, which has a certain relevance for the United States. And on the other hand, the Secret Service would, invest a lot of money into art. And that was kind of this time cover, but I still would ask myself how everyone kind of reacted to that. And one question to Kochiro, you mentioned Okabe and his biography, and you kind of casually also mentioned that he went to prison for 6 or 7 years for alleged or maybe confirmed war crimes. And I wonder how that fit into his biography and how that was viewed at that time and maybe also from nowadays in retrospect. Thank you.
Yeah, so 7 years was the period of purge. So he couldn't get to take an official position for 7 years. And that was 12 months from 55 and 56 when he was imprisoned at the Sycamore prison. So there were, I mentioned really briefly that the museum directors, especially these national institutions, are often the politicians. So, I mean, if you kind of think the museum as a place where things should be democratic, and he's certainly not the figure to fit into this picture. But this was not really talked about in the 50s at least. Partly because there are so many politicians like him. He was imprisoned and then he got released. And for example, the Kishi, the prime minister, and then the foreign minister that I was kind of mentioned in the presentation, he was a class A war criminal. And he didn't get charged, arguably because of the negotiation within the United States. So he left the prison and went back to the cabinet. He was really pushing the pro-American policies. So that probably was something that people would talk about, but there was no evidence. So, it's very difficult to kind of defend your position in a way. There was only 2012 when the CIA documents were kind of declassified, where this kind of rumor turned out to be true. So I think there's a subtle, well, not subtle, there's a generation gap in acknowledging the fact and what's the being imprisoned for a charge of war criminal meant.
To answer your question, the restructuring of the Congress of Cultural Freedom in '67 is because of public outcry within the US. But what's interesting is there have been a lot of documents and interviews even with the editors for Rampart Arts, the student editors that first launched that. So I should say Rampart did the first sort of expose, but New York Times ended up doing a larger one, and it went from just the student associations to these other intellectual associations. So there was this moment between 66, 67 that exposed sort of intelligence money, right, in these systems. Whereas in Southeast Asia, there was maybe a sense that it was there and it was considered. So when I say it's an open secret, this is what I'm being told in interviews by people like, yeah, we knew, but who cares, Like, you can try to convince me, but I'm still going to have my own ideas. But there isn't like I'm just qualifying that there isn't like a textual account, So other than interviews with people of the time, because it's interesting, depending on where you go in the region and who you talk to, and at what point, there were artists also that don't want to be associated with the system and who only now, years later, say, yes, oh, I did work for the USIS, or I did, so just to hold that. But within the U.S., yes, there was a reaction from civil society, and that led essentially to the restructuring and funds not being used in that way. But it's interesting because in one of the sources from one of the Rampart editors had mentioned that actually some of this had already come out in the 50s with McCarthy. And no one really picked up on it as much, but it really was maybe this moment, after Vietnam, the sort of civil rights sort of issues coming up, that then you had more of this backlash by the 60s. Within art history, it's a thing. I mean, there's this whole moment within Art Forum. A series of articles gets published in the 60s into the 70s that really talk about that whole narrative of abstract expressionism and the CIA and the sort of American nationalism that we sort of have in pop. I call it pop culture because I think like there needs to be more interrogation of that narrative. I feel like it's part of an American national history that shouldn't be so readily absorbed into the way that we write our own regional art histories, because there's a moment there of American civil society dealing with their own political system, whereas the political systems in which culture is produced in Southeast Asia and East Asia are a little bit different. So what it's being, so I hope that answers your question, but also complicates some of this, because I think that this is a contested kind of discursive space, and actually where you write this art history from has implications and generational implications, actually, I think.
I have a question for Kathleen and for Soo-Young related to the terminologies, right, or the choice of words that you're using. So Kathleen, you use the term flows, particularly flows of capital and ideas and networks. And Soo-Young, you're using networks and network mobilization. And I was wondering, are you all drawing on particular authors or theoretical paradigms to use these terms, because they could mean different things in different sets of writings? And, I'm really thinking of Arjun Appadurai's usage of the term flows, but he conceives of flows in a world that is borderless, which is not the case with the period that we're looking at. Borders really matter, particularly, for the emergence of new nation states. So if you could just shed light on where are these terms coming from?
For me, it really comes from logistics studies and network and logistics studies. So I'll say it sounds a bit strange to say this, but I would say the foundation of a lot of this work that I do comes from the work of even like Keller Easterling's on extra statecraft. So it's really like looking at agencies of actors and and cybernetics, essentially, which is the Gregory Bateson reference a bit. I mean, there is a density to some of these things, and these networks being human networks and feedback systems. So I hope that answers it a bit, because it's a different positionality, but it's also a very material history approach. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. For me, I was drawing more directly from the period. Actually, I tried to avoid the term alliance because the Kim Young-gi and the group that he led throughout Southeast Asia constantly used the term network in order to describe their activity, which I thought was quite interesting, because I think already they're trying to avoid or move away from this sort of like one-on-one allyship or alliance that was very much imposed through this Cold War binarity. And they were reimagining through their mobilizations across East and Southeast Asia, a networked association of artists across the region. So that was like a conscious decision based on the terms that the artists were using at the time.
Can I add one small thing to that? I think I just want to respond in relation to Soo-Young's comments, and also Miyu, how you opened us up to think about regionalism and Priya, your question about borders. I think when we start thinking, so Patrick Flores has this idea about thinking about geopoetics, right? And that is about geopoetics is parallel to geopolitics, where geopolitics is kind of a hard edge. The art space opens up a certain type of geopoetics to imagine other forms of regionalism. And I think the regionalism that maybe is coming out of the work that I am sharing with you, but also Suyong, I think parallel, because I've seen you present this research a number of times, but also when we talk about the networks of artists associated with the United Nations or UNESCO, and the liberal framework, these are also personal networks. These are friendships. These are certain mobilities that come up that are possible right after World War II in the 50s. But by the 70s, that's different. When the nation state becomes more consolidated, right, and the international system becomes one not based on certain types of personal mobility, which might be tied to class, might be tied to education, might be tied to the former empire, privileges associated with the former system of empire before the war. By the 70s, I think when that international order of self-determinism defines the international order and the nation state is a little more solidified and you enter the international through the nation state, it's a different network. It's a different form of mobility. It's a different form of regionalism. ASEAN, for me, that's ASEAN, right? Because it's the association by participation through the nation state. Takdir is another imagination. And if you notice, even with the Asian American Assembly, sorry to go back to my case study, you're talking about a Sri Lankan, a Ceylonese, and a Indonesian functioning out of Malaya, aka KL Malaysia. It's a different type of imagination of Southeast Asia. It's a different type of regionalizing, and yeah.
I want to also ask Soyoung, how would you assess the legacy of the UNESCO publication, Korea, in Korea? The reason is because UNESCO has gone through, or rather the ideologue of UNESCO has gone through different phases, right? So I'm speaking about Levi Strauss, who is this anthropologist, actually very much influenced by cybernetics in the US, and came back after the war to Paris and headed the sort of social sciences department there. And he had, so in the immediate post-war time, his idea of the culture and what UNESCO should do is to basically, open, every place on this planet has its own culture, and we should all be opening up to each other and learn from each other. But then some 20 years later, there's a certain correction. He corrected himself. And he actually published another essay on Korea, in which he said something to the effect that, actually the industrialized West and capitalistic West is I'm paraphrasing obviously, it's basically eroding a lot of this other culture. So so for the smaller cultures, essentially you had to actually not be too open, otherwise you'd be gone. This is a very crass reduction that I'm doing, but I find it interesting that even in international organizations and in the top sort of ideologues and diplomats and bureaucrats functioning in oiling these institutions and in churning out policies and in essentially making the world's culture, right, in wielding world culture. It's it's never it's never a stable. There's never really a stable understanding of culture. So because you looked a lot into UNESCO's footprint in Korea, I wonder if you have any.
Yeah, actually, the cover image that I showed of the career demonstrates how a lot of their print publications and print promotions were actually headed under this like larger umbrella of the major project, the UNESCO major project of like learning Eastern and Western culture and bringing them together into dialogue. So a lot of their issues and contributions for Korea were actually selected under these sort of larger objectives that were set by the UNESCO in 1956. And what's interesting, as you mentioned, Yomi, is this notion of culture shifts throughout different periods of Cold War. And in the very beginning, in the early phases of this sort of major project of UNESCO, they really like sort of tried to define culture as something that could reflect the contemporary times, like this shifting political climate. And rather than shying away from the contradictions and conflicts that were unfolding throughout different parts of the world, and both sort of like the polarized world, they thought actually culture is one aspect that could really address and reflect on this sort of contradictions and conflicts that can otherwise be resolved. So I think UNESCO was really trying to focus on this role of culture to shed light on the contemporary political conditions of the time. And that's why you had the USSR taking part in Korea and contributing a lot of their issues, which was very rare thinking about the early period of Cold War. But initially, Korea was very much led by the ideas of Levi-Strauss. But when this sort of major project of the UNESCO took place in 1956 and onwards, like through 1960s, it was really Herbert Reed, the British art historian who also specializes in sculpture and education, who guided or formulated the idea of culture in relation to education. And that's why it has such a huge impact in Korea at the beginning, because it was less about culture, but more about educating culture and how culture should be taught in Korea. And a lot of the initial UNESCO-led conferences and workshops were actually culture in relation to teaching, or like art in relation to education, and bringing together artist teachers or art teachers across Asia, across region, together to think about what it means to teach culture to each other, and to come out of this ignorance that led to the two world wars. So I guess to answer your question in short, it was in Korea at least. In the period of 1950s and early 60s, culture was very much understood in relation to this idea of education and educating the ignorance.
Yes, thank you very much for your input. I have connecting to me a question about terms, and this is the term of cultural repair used. And maybe you can explain again what it means for you. And I was wondering what, or if this term is used and meaningful for the other speakers too. I mean, we went to South Korea some weeks ago, and I was thinking, what is your idea about cultural repair? Yeah, that's my question.
Oh, cultural repair. Yes. Yeah, what is my idea for that?
It's super short answer. I mean, I think the context of the question is because we have a cooperation with Guangzhou Biennale and looking at documenta in relation to post-war West Germany, and Guangzhou Biennale in relation to Guangzhou and the democratization of Korea and all the riot and violence in the 80s. So in that context, there's a sort of sense of art as a repairing tool. Mm-hmm. Right, and that's still a thesis that we need to prove or disprove, and hence I think that's the context of the question.
So was that the question for me or for Coach? Oh, okay.
I don't have an answer yet.
Well, for me, I mean, talking about the money and who funds into this thing, and as like the Japan Foundation, for example, that the idea they have for regional support, like particularly Southeast Asia, is to do with this idea of, well, reparation.
Okay.
So, like repair and culture, or like a political repair. I mean, I don't really have an answer for this, but this has to be something that should be analyzed more. Yes, yeah.
But for me, in response to your presentation, Koichiro, I found it really interesting how you mentioned, or like you posed this question, whether bureaucracy can function as a form of repair. And really, I think you see this bureaucratic practice in a very nuanced way. And that's when I was thinking about this like notion of repair in relation to the Gwangju Biennial and Documenta. That repair was seen by different people and like defined by people in different ways. For instance, how certain people, the locals, especially in Gwangju, were seeing that you need to repair the trauma first in order to get into this mode of revisiting it through culture or revitalizing it through culture, whereas politicians saw it as use culture in order to repair the trauma and to really come out of that trauma. So I think there were sort of intersecting views on how to define repair and when to execute or to put repair into practice through culture. So I found that your point quite resonant through, this is a slightly different context, but with Gwangju.
I think that's that's a very nice way to end the first panel. Maybe I'll zoom out a little bit because I think what the panel has made clear is that I said this earlier today that I think all of us Southern historical lessons can be useful these days. So so obviously we know that whatever we do, we're never free from ideology or politics or economic actors and all of it. So and without making ourselves completely paralyzed and not being able to do anything than say a sort of incessant self-critique, which also happens a lot in the art world. I think we just need to be clear about the conditions while still trying to make brave moves, as a lot of the historical predecessors actually have shown us. Of course, with mixed reviews and of course with mixed price, but sometimes not necessarily on the right moral side. But I think maybe it's still too early to tell. And just apropos for the too early to tell, this is an anecdote that actually Zizek retells, which came out of a conversation between a foreign correspondent and the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai at Bandung. The question from the foreign correspondent was, Premier Zhou, what do you think about the French Revolution? And the answer was, it's too early to tell. Okay, so now 30 minutes of coffee break, and we'll come back at 4 p.m.